Friday, 23rd December at 8:30 p.m. on Wacana English Edition. We look back on 2022 and the biggest issues we faced as a nation. We began the year with floods claiming several dozen lives and are closing it with continued flash floods displacing over 70,000 to date. There are ongoing challenges of pandemic-related economic recovery, plus a new federal government after GE15. We the Rakyat have been through plenty this year. What are some of the lessons we have learned? How do we make the best of both the highs and lows? And where do we go from here? Building a better Malaysia for everyone. Join our panel of experts and me, Tamina Kausji, this Friday at 8:30 p.m. as we discuss all things 2022 and Malaysia's path forward heading into the new year. Follow all Sinar Daily's social media platforms for the latest updates and catch us live on sinardaily.my, Sinar Daily's Facebook and YouTube channel.
Very good evening, everyone. Welcome to the talk show that takes all our English-speaking viewers through the political, social, and economic landscape of Malaysia. This is Wacana English Edition with me, Tamina Kausji. Now, of course, it is our last show before we wrap the year, and it's going to be a retrospective of all things 2022, politics, economics, cost of living, of course, the climate crisis, and the very fact that we are going through ongoing flash floods around the country. So with all of that in mind and more, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome our stellar panel for the evening, joining us both online and in person. Beginning with political economy expert, Professor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, joining us online due to actually the flash floods going on in the KL area. Hi, Prof. Terence. Lovely to have you with us. We also have joining us in the studio with me, I've got environmental, social, and governance ESG expert, Akram Shah Sanusi. Akram, pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure's all mine, thanks.
And last but certainly not least, Adelina Zulkifli, Women's Aid Organization, WAO's Capacity Building Officer. Absolutely. So welcome, everyone. Let's get straight into it. I think we've got a solid hour's discussion ahead. I want to start off by asking Prof. Terence. We're one day shy, Prof, of the first 30 days of the new federal government led by Anwar Ibrahim, 10th Prime Minister of Malaysia. Your thoughts on this week's parliament session and what it hopefully augurs for the first 100 days of this new federal government?
Well, first, let me be clear what we are experiencing post-election. G15 is historic. We have never had a hung parliament. And since then, what we have seen is the coming together of rather strange bedfellows to form a government. Now, I want to stress this, although this is unprecedented, the fact of the matter is coalitions can be good. And here we have a coalition comprising representatives from different parties, representing different constituencies. It has regional representation, Sabah and Sarawak included, ethnic representation. And this is important because even the previous government, Prime Minister Muhyiddin once acknowledged that Sabah and Sarawak, as well as 4 other states, have been left behind. So what we have here now is a possibility for Anwar to create what we call an inclusive form of dialogue to bring those left behind into the policy-making process. I want to make one more point. The transition to democracy we have seen in developing economies around the world, Latin America as well as Southeast Asia more recently, has always been characterized by problems. The best example is look at what happened in the Philippines and Indonesia during their transition to democracy. It took them about 10 years to consolidate democracy. So what we are experiencing now in Malaysia, the events we have seen over the past 4 years, is an outcome of this transition to democracy after the fall of the Barisan Nasional. What we have to focus now is how do we, with this new government, ensure a smooth consolidation of democracy going forward. Which brings me to your question about the first session in Parliament. I must say I am disappointed because I expected better from the opposition. After all, the opposition has been in government. They know the issues and the policies. And I thought they would be in a good position now to discuss the merits and the demerits of Anwar's initial announcements about institutional reforms, procurement process, and so on and so forth. Instead, the opposition focused on, well, character assassination, mudslinging. This is totally unbecoming of parliamentarians in the August House. I must stress this. I hope going forward we will see more thoughtful discussion on the economy, which is a serious issue, and solving real problems, especially of those in the poorer states. And I think this can be done because PAS and Bersatu, who are now in opposition, have a significant presence in these underdeveloped states, and they can really contribute to the parliamentary discussion by bringing their problems to bear on when policies are being discussed in parliament.
Great points there, Prof. And definitely the opposition could have done far more. But however, on the flip side of things, it did seem like what they were creating was a lot more misinformation for their own social channels. But moving along from there, Adelina, now despite the number of women in cabinet being pretty much the same as in the previous GE14, we're still not even touching 15%. At the same time, women ministers in cabinet this time around have been given more critical and arguably less gendered portfolios. For the very first time, we're seeing a health minister as well as an education minister who are both women, together with only our second ever female youth and sports minister. But what have you observed on the other side when it comes to public and I would say social media and online gender-based violence when it comes to these female policymakers, even though everyone is literally brand new?
So first and foremost, I would say like the response and the perception of them are amazing. We are really rooting for all of them to do a good job. I think for Hannah Yeoh, for example, she's holding the sports cabinet, and it's a very universal thing. Everyone loves sports, so that's a good thing. I do think it's important to note that 85% of online GBV people that face it are women. And so whenever people make comments about our politicians and if they're women, it's always like a derogatory comment about their body and is body shaming them. Which I don't think happens to men. So despite having all of these things and having more representation of women in parliament, we do need to be more mindful of our language because they are under more scrutiny now that they're holding such notable posts.
Absolutely. And any thoughts also on the kind of pushback that they have been getting back towards policies such as the recently announced one from Health Minister Dr. Zaleha, whereby a small rollout of especially sanitary care supplies would be done in the KKM department itself. However, do you feel it was a scenario of it not being possibly communicated in the best way, or is it that it happened to be a female minister making those points?
I think oftentimes like they have very good ideas and they try to enact it, but there's a bit of problems with like the execution. And so I think with more communication and obviously more stakeholders working together, we could have avoided all these pushback. But I think starting to talk about period poverty is already such a win for us, and we should just work together and just do it as best as we can.
Absolutely, and I think it's really great that you have reminded us that we've come this far in just a couple of short years. I think even 5 years ago, period poverty, while omnipresent, was really not discussed, not to say just openly, but also addressed in a policy-making manner. Akram, I want to move into a really, really urgent topic, the floods, which are ongoing not only nationwide, but also in the Klang Valley. We have over 70,000 Malaysians already evacuated around the country. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis. But what will it take for Malaysia to enact or declare a climate emergency? And strategically speaking, what should the path forward be, especially in the immediate now, while it's continuing?
Thank you for this question. Actually, you would argue that this was urgent, extremely urgent actually as of 2 years ago. This is not the first incident that we've seen scenarios facing us now. In fact, that scenario is actually further developing because we're expecting another storm front to impact the peninsula coming into next week.
That's right.
So in fact, that the meteorologists are saying actually that the impact will be so extreme that it might actually go over the Titiwangsa, mountains and hit into the west coast as well. So, but what actually is important isn't just what we do in terms of addressing the climate issues, because that's actually a global approach or a global management issue. But there's also local policies and local initiatives that you need to put in place. And I'm not even talking about carbon sequestration, carbon taxes, or activities that are more of economic nature that pushes us towards climate action. Just practical activities that should have begun some time ago. For instance, after what happened on the foot of Gunung Jerai, which is very close to my heart because it's actually my kampung, it was noted that what they say the water head or kepala air had shifted. Now, when they say kepala air, the feeling is as if that's some sort of traditional thing, but actually it's not. It's a
Right.
hydrological view that basically the hydrological structure of that mountain range and also the water channels, both rivers as well as subterranean, have actually shifted. So at the foot of Mount Jerai, effectively what's happened is that the flood area had shifted from the north of the mountain towards the sea. Now that's a significant change, and that was actually one of the key warning signs we should have seen, that this could actually be repeated elsewhere. Now we saw this happening again actually during the late last year, early year floods in the Klang Valley.
That's right.
I mean, a lot of words have been said about how the sea level actually had started hitting and actually seeing overflow during that time. But it's more significant if you look at the area of Hulu Langat, where you actually had a collapse of roads, widening of rivers. That's significant signals of hydrological change. But our response is still too reactive. The government policies have been all about, let's have people help the people with the disaster, let's fix the roads, help with telco towers, which were down for 70 days, by the way.
That's correct.
So people
Yes.
couldn't communicate the problems they were facing. So the problem isn't that there was no response to the disaster. The problem is there is then no action to mitigate future disasters.
Exactly. And this is something that has been affecting especially the East Coast all the way very severely since 2013, 2014.
Indeed, and since the root cause issue now has become hydrological, the kickstart of the process should be really a significant hydrological survey across the entire country. And that actually might create a lot of discovery. Now, we can't go back down the route of traditional means of fixing these problems, like extra drains, flood barriers and stuff like that. If we're talking about serious climate change and climate action mitigation, we're talking about sea barriers. We're
Right.
talking about, Malaysia has done significant enough of reclamation that we should know how to reclaim, right? But
Correct.
and we have some nice sea barriers actually in pockets, like in Langkawi, this nice sea barrier that protects the area facing the airport. But these are significant activities that need to be thought of, discussed, and actually planned for. So hydrological studies inland, and also a real look at our risk facing the seas. And that has significant impact in terms of activities all across the board, social activities, neighborhood, economic activities. So yes, a national priority is needed, and it's a significant piece of activity that we're going into an economic crisis. Government should be looking at ways to actually invest, ways in terms of channeling activity from government funds. This is actually a necessity, but it actually can also give birth to significant infrastructure activity that will be useful for the country in economic terms as well.
Absolutely. And let's not forget that last year's flood cycle, December 2021, losses in excess of $1 billion just for the main central Klang Valley area.
Indeed,
Right. Thank you so much for that, Akram. Now, Prof. Terence, moving back into, of course, government of the day and the fact that when it comes to government business relations and the forthcoming GLC appointments, which Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim says will be made on the basis of capability and experiences. Your thoughts on this so far?
Well, Tamina, I must say this is a good start on the part of the Prime Minister. The fact of the matter is political appointments in the GLCs have always been abused. Let's go back to the time when the Sheraton move occurred, when the Prime Minister at that time, Muhyiddin, wanted to consolidate his position. He did this by not only expanding the cabinet, for those who could not be appointed to the cabinet, he gave them prominent GLC appointments. So clearly the GLCs were a political tool to consolidate power. Now, what is also important, if you go back to that time, in 2020, that's when we had the COVID pandemic. And when the COVID pandemic occurred, then Finance Minister Tunku Zafrul announced that he was going to use the GLC ecosystem. This was a defining moment because it showed Malaysians how important this GLC ecosystem is. And I'll give you some examples of what they did. For example, in the case of the banking sector, there was a moratorium on loans by the GLC banks. If you look at Tenaga, they cut the rates for the use of power supply. If you look at the telecommunications sector too, there was also an important cutting of costs for use of telecommunications at a time when we were now shifting towards a digital economy. So that pandemic indicated to us how important the GLC ecosystem is. It can be used to save an economy, especially when the private sector had gone into a lockdown. Now, this brings us then to the issue of what Anwar is doing here. As I mentioned, the Mohideen government showed us how the GLC system can be abused. The pandemic indicated to us how we cannot allow for such an abuse. Now, what is important here is we have no clue whatsoever how big this GLC ecosystem is. When we talk about GLCs, we are talking about sovereign wealth funds like Khazanah. We are talking about pension and savings funds like EPF, KWAP, PNB. We are talking about major holding companies like Minister of Finance Incorporated. We are talking about statutory bodies which reach out into the rural areas like Kasada and Katanga. We are talking about special purpose vehicles and companies, actual companies. The size of this GLC ecosystem is so huge that Mahathir, when he was in the opposition, referred to it as a monster. He called it a shadow economy. Now, we don't know how big this GLC ecosystem is. The government itself, the Ministry of Finance, people have confirmed to me they themselves have no clue how big this GLC ecosystem is. And yet, I want to make one more point. Mohideen himself acknowledged this when he announced the Pekuko plan. I'm not sure whether most people know about this plan. Pekuko was a plan to reform the GLCs, and 6 billion ringgit was allotted just for this. It goes to show you how important the GLICs, that is KWAP, EPF, PNB, these are the GLICs, including Khazanah, how important they are. What happened to all this money? What happened to the reforms? So this brings us now to what Anwar Ibrahim has just announced. But my concerns here are this. I just told you all how big this GLC ecosystem is. So why is he limiting it only to GLCs under the Ministry of Finance? Why not even all the GLCs under the different ministries? My second point of concern, why is there no mention about this point about the selection process of new appointees? We already know the selection process is problematic. Anwar has now confirmed that politicians may be appointed to some GLCs. I have no problems with that. That's true. We may need politicians in some GLCs, depending on the nature of the GLCs. But this brings us to the important point. If the Prime Minister is saying that there may be political appointees in the GLCs, including under his administration, then he must put in place also a system to ensure that these appointments are done in a transparent and accountable manner. I would argue that he would need to create an independent GLC commission, which is responsible for such appointments. And they're accountable to Parliament, not to him, not to the Prime Minister, not to the Cabinet, to ensure checks and balances. I would argue in the long run, there should also be a GLC Act. Now, these recommendations are making recommendations which are things which we have seen in other countries, which have GLCs, or what they call it, state-owned enterprises. So I'd like to stop here by saying this. For a start, Anwar has done something very good, but he's still got some way to go in terms of inspiring confidence in the private sector that the GLC reforms are going to be done properly.
Independent GLC Commission, GLC Act, moving forth for maximum transparency. Yes, Akram. Absolutely.
I had the good fortune of actually not just being a board member in a couple of GLCs, but I was also actually the chairman of Mara Corporation, which is actually a very small clique under Mara. And this was during the period of the PH government from 2018 to 2020. So what we found when we actually entered these GLCs was that there was a process of governance. But the problem is actually the discipline in adhering to it fully. And indeed, as Professor said, the problem here is that there is sort of like a political imperative that actually sometimes overwhelms things. In truth, what we did was actually we proceeded with forensic accounting measures across this GLC. So invariably, wherever the GLICs or GLCs actually go down the route of actually doing some forensic accounting, once there is actually suspicion of wrongdoing or underperformance. And it was clear. I mean, like for instance, with regards to LTAT, it was actually insolvent when we joined the board. So these are warning signs, right? True. Now, then that leads directly to what Professor was also alluding to, the competency of the board members, and also the what do you call it, the moral standing, the moral character of the board members are very important. Now, why is that? Actually, they're all political appointees. The problem we have with the word political appointee is that people think that when the appointee is a politician, that's a political appointee. No, they are all political appointees
At the end of the day.
because they were appointed by politicians, and the appointment letter is signed by the Prime Minister, Finance Minister, whatever minister that GLC is linked to. And because of that, you can be called up any time by the person who signed your appointment letter to say, hey, you got to toe a line, this is what I want you to do.
That's right.
And with regards to a couple of these GLCs, I'm proud to say, we actually stood up and said no. And I understood that actually happened quite a lot during the period of the Pakatan Harapan government. And as a result of that, other board members who actually were appointees from government agencies, etc., started growing a spine, realizing at last that actually this is the right thing to do. Now, we need to actually bring that culture and really reinforce this culture during this period. So again, I'm very grateful that Professor said that it's fine for politicians to be what do you call it, board members, because it's not really whether you're a politician or not. It's really whether you have the competency and whether you have moral character. That's also quite important, and you can actually tell based on the track record of where it is that actually you're thinking of appointing.
Thank you, Akram, for pointing out the behind the scenes as well and what happened during the former PH administration. Adelina, I do have a question regarding legal reforms, but we go into a quick break. We'll be back right after that to continue this conversation. Do stay tuned.
Using smart machine that we created, then people can have a same flavor. Machine would never take leave, would never, have issue in leaving a company. So the machine will continuously work based on what we have set them to do.
Every day, we collect about 5 to 10 kilograms of coffee grounds. This waste can be used as a fertilizer. So for now, this year, we distribute the coffee grounds to individual and also green finger community at our neighborhood. For example, at TTDI and also Bukit Jelutong.
Welcome back. This is Wacana English Edition with me, Tamina Kowski. So today, of course, we're going through a wrap up of 2022, the year that was, and what do we have to look forward to? Adelina, jumping straight back into the conversation. So looking at certain law reforms which are in progress, currently under YB Azalina's purview, there's of course the bill to abolish mandatory death penalties that will be tabled in Feb 23, as well as your thoughts on this and other key areas, particularly concerning women's rights, the Anti-Sexual Harassment Act, Anti-Stalking Bill, the recently tabled and passed Housewife Social Security Bill. What further improvements are needed before they become truly utilitarian for the Rakyat and, of course, women?
So I'll touch upon the anti-sexual harassment bill first. It's surreal that women's group have been fighting for this for over 30 years and now it's come to fruition. And I remember the day we were in the office and we saw the headlines and we were just over the moon. But it just also baffles us that it's taking us this long to even recognize it as a problem and having a legislation regarding that. So I think it's really a promising step that they are being tabled / have been passed. Although there are many things that we still need to do, because as for like the anti-sexual harassment bill, the tribunals are still not up and coming yet. And as for the anti-stalking bill, and also just relating to the other ones as well, despite it being tabled and being passed, there are gaps within the legislation that need communication, I think, mostly from women's group and of course the women themselves, because they, at the end of the day, are the beneficiaries. And so if we communicate with them and consult them, we know what we can add on to the legislation to make it fully effective. And of course, I think just relates to the point that I said just now about execution, because once we have the bill, how are we going to move forward with it? Are most agencies going to be schooled on the bills? How are they going to move forward from that? And with regards to the death penalty, I'm just going to go about in the women's point of view. There are many women who have been accused and are in prison because they have been lied, scammed, duped by their partners, or they're they have been drug mules, and so with the death penalty being abolished, a lot of them would be free. And that's just where I want to add in that perhaps rehabilitation is a better way to go about than punishment, because death penalty is very much not in line with human rights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Alina. Akram, now moving into, of course, the Batang Kali landslide this week, was it preventable, aside from, of course, the tragic loss of almost 30 lives with a couple others still missing? What mechanisms will ensure disaster risk reduction and hopefully accountability in the future?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of talk in Malaysia about how there's a lot of red tape. As everything needs to be licensed,
Sure.
everything needs to be done in a certain way, etc. But there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. The first disconnect is that because there's a worry about red tape, because people want to avoid all the licenses and whatever requirements that's needed, people tend to close one eye or bypass. And I found it interesting that people were saying that, or at least really some of those involved were saying that, oh, because we were advised by the Ministry of Agriculture that we didn't need a permit. Okay, you're not supposed to be talking to the Ministry of Agriculture. It's something to do with the Ministry of Agriculture. That's, governing what you're doing in terms of the agricultural activities. You're doing leisure activities. You should be talking to, besides you're talking to the to the Ministry of Tourism, perhaps, if you're looking for a ministry. But in the first place, you're talking about an activity, an economic activity in a particular daerah or area. You should be going to the, to the nearest land office or the nearest pejabat daerah and have a conversation with the Tok Penghulu, because you're talking about areas which are relatively rural, where there is actually an infrastructure that has been in place for hundreds of years.
Exactly.
When you actually want to do activities of this sort of thing. Now, why is there then a breakdown or disconnect? I have a feeling that this is actually true for much of Malaysia when it comes to things that's related to environment, our local natural environment, all the way through to big policy issues. We are sitting on the base of a constitution and also rules and laws which are outdated. Decades, maybe even since independence. And the same is especially true when it comes to governance of nature and also in management of our natural resources and also climate, of course. Now, this needs drastic reform and drastic change. But and legal frameworks need to be put in place. And if you're talking about legal frameworks potentially being something that's a bit long-winded, you bring it Parliament, etc. At the very least, there should be some guidelines and rules readily put into place in all of these local areas in terms of how you manage. And look, believe you me, I'm very familiar with the idea of non-licenses. Again, back to my kampung, Kaki Gunung Jerai, Yan. The vast majority of the chalet operations there are unlicensed. But no one shuts them down because it will affect the local economy. And why is it then we haven't crossed the, met halfway or, or even tried to do the hard work that's needed to actually close that gap?
Sustainability as well.
And it reaches down, it leads back down to whether or not these businesses are sustainable, not just in terms of economic terms, but what are they doing? What are the activities they're doing? If they're not, properly governed, or there's no proper governance in it, and the governance doesn't have to be heavy-handed. And that's where they say there's a disconnect. They don't want to get the licenses because the local authorities are heavy-handed.
Assumption is yes.
Well, actually, to be honest, some of them are, but then they probably need better training. They need better guidelines. They need better oversight. I mean, look, we've become more and more familiar about what situation are also in local government in Malaysia. I'm not really too much of a fan of the politics of how local government or how local governance should be done. I just believe that we should have it done properly. And some of the signals that come up is like, for instance, 70% of the staff in a local area is from the same kampung. How can that be? And when I say this, I think you've got people snickering back in my kampung and other kampungs in all the world of Malaysia, because it's what happens. And
then also on the flip side, others saying that what's wrong with that? There you go. All right. Thank you, Akram, for raising some Really, really pertinent points. Prof. Terence, I'd like to shift back the lens towards another institutional wrought concern. Let's look at the Azam Baki case, MACC reforms. You, of course, in fact, quit the MACC's consultation and corruption prevention panel last December over this very issue. What do you foresee happening now, or what needs to continue to happen, and of course was truncated during the past year?
Well, first, Tamina, I want to thank you for raising this question. This is an important issue. During the run-up to the election, the Pakatan Harapan mentioned it very clearly in the manifesto that they're going to tackle corruption. In fact, if you look at the campaign period, the second most important issue during the campaign after the economy was on corruption. Clearly, you can see that the Rakyat has been very concerned about the scale and the scope of corruption in this country. It really is an issue we must tackle quickly. However, here's the problem. When the Azam Baki case came up, it exposed that the institution primarily responsible for tackling corruption is now also under a cloud. If its chief commissioner has got serious allegations of corruption against him about the issue of the equity ownership that he has, then this issue must be tackled immediately. Now, the government under Ismail Sabri did not do that. They procrastinated, they hesitated. And that's totally unbecoming of a government that is serious about acting on corruption. The advisory board, which was supposed to act firmly, did not act firmly. In fact, at one point, they even distanced themselves from the commissioner. And then later, after the controversy died down, they went back to acting like as if nothing had happened. Azam Baki did not appear in parliament to defend himself. So here we are talking about an issue where if the MACC commissioner is under a cloud, shouldn't the government take action against him immediately, put him on garden leave, allow him to defend himself? But until such time, acting MACC commissioner should be appointed. My second issue, the government talks extensively about the need for whistleblowers to come forward. The MACC board of governors also talk about the need for whistleblowers to come forward and expose corruption. But how does the Azam Baki case inspire confidence in whistleblowers? In this particular case, the whistleblower was sued and was silenced. Meanwhile, Azam Baki carries on as normal. So how can the government inspire confidence in whistleblowers to come forth and expose corruption when they have seen what has happened in the case of Lalita, who exposed his corruption but now has been silenced, in fact, even sued. So I have a serious problem here with the government of the day. Pakatan Harapan mentioned in their manifesto. I thought one of the first things they will do is, because of this controversy, ask Azam Baki to go on leave. But so far, nothing has happened. I'll give the government of the day some benefit of the doubt because it's still early days. But to my mind, this should have been acted on immediately. I'd like to go on to one more point about the GIACC, which you also mentioned. I think it's good. It's good that we consider trimming the fat if there is fat. It's good to review these processes. This is where the institutional reforms come into play. But I'd like to make one more point. When it was the Pakatan government that introduced the GIACC, and one of the reasons why they introduced it was also because the country needs an independent institution to monitor corruption. And I would have thought that that's where the GICC would be moving in, some independent institution which will also monitor how the MECC is functioning and act accordingly. So far, all this has not happened. So as far as corruption is concerned, Tamina, I must make this point. There's a lot of things that need to be done. It was a serious matter during the campaign period. It's clear that we want to act on this matter. And if the government does not act firmly, then I'm afraid it will not inspire confidence that investors can be sure that there will not be serious corruption transpiring when they do invest in the economy.
So much for that, Prof. And Adelina, speaking of other outdated laws, Akram, of course, had referred to some before. One of the most prominent women's rights issues this year, naturally, of course, has been the continued debacle over automatic citizenship rights for mothers, Malaysian mothers, for conferring upon foreign-born children. Why is this so fundamental, and is there finally political will to amend the Constitution, which is what needs to be done at the end of the day?
Why is it such a fundamental thing? I think because it relates to life or death for someone. And we've seen that through COVID, people were parted and you couldn't even see your family members, which makes it such a pressing issue. And in terms of the issue, like Malaysia is one of the 28 countries that still don't allow mothers to pass on their citizenship. And if that doesn't show how outdated that is, I don't know what is. So we have had Princip Jus Soli in the past. If you're born here, you can get citizenship here. But now we're moving with the times, and with migration and all, we should be able to update the laws. And so mothers should definitely be able to pass on their citizenship, and it shouldn't be such a hassle for them, and it shouldn't take years and years for them, because then they would have to leave the country with their children and all that. And just touching on, say, a mom who's stuck in an abusive marriage, does it mean that she has to stay in the abusive marriage because she can't leave, because then she'll be separated with her kid, and just poses an even more troubling issue as well. And I think just with that issue as well, even with the number of applications that were approved, that's no guarantee that they did get their documentation. If you correct me if I'm wrong. And we just need to push it more and more forward. So is our government going to take action on this? The amendment that states on gender equality has said that nationality does not fall under the scope of this. And I think that reflects perhaps how the attitude on this issue is. And they're saying that, it's not something that the courts can decide. So it's really up to us. I do see promising MPs pushing for it. And the fact that it's not just women MPs, it's MPs across different parties, different ethnicities, but the government is still this hesitancy. So we'll just have to wait and see for that, honestly.
That's right. And also, I think it's important to point out that the manifestos of all major political parties actually did mention specifically this issue, considering that women are at least 50% of your voting populace as well. Definitely time to change this outdated, archaic law. One final one, Akram. I wanted to speak about looking at the fact that the Federal Territories Ministry has now been converted into a department under the purview of the PMO. So do you feel this augurs towards a step towards some form of local elections, perhaps, in the near future? And how would this possibly empower the Rakyat, who actually, of course, haven't had access to this since the 60s?
Yeah, actually, to be honest, I found the step actually relatively confusing. Because,
Why so?
Having it put under the purview of the Prime Minister perhaps indicates a certain amount of, priority that he wants to place. But whether that priority is necessarily in terms of the quest towards local government may not necessarily be so, because this is specifically for the federal territories. And it may actually have different slants. It might be related to development. It might be simply just because, for political purposes, because you just can't get another ministerial position in since he wants to trim down the number of cabinet ministers. In reality, if you actually want to focus on change in terms of local government, the empowerment should be more in terms of the minister for local government, and perhaps empowering him by moving, that ministry or that department to be under his ministry. Because actually the position of the Ministry of the Federal Territories is relatively new, I suppose, but I suppose it depends on what you mean by new, because it's something like created only about 15 to 20 years ago, and it used to be actually part of other ministries. So I don't know. I think it's premature to overread on that. And in any case, I find discussions around this to be a bit of a distraction. And perhaps if you don't mind, just want to touch a bit around on this thing around distraction. I mean, I agree with Professor Terence Gomez earlier about how this parliament has been disappointing. But for me, what has been disappointing is basically a lack of emphasis on some of the mistakes that was done by the previous government, and those mistakes which are very much political in nature, in trying to shore up the leadership of the previous prime minister. Like for instance, they rushed the energy policy through, but an energy policy that was outdated. It was clearly outdated because it looked like it was actually prepared before COP26, which is the climate change conference
That's
that was
right.
done in Glasgow at the end of last year, and now it's COP27. And it was blatantly clear because it says that our solar generation will increase from 1 to 4% by 2040. We should be hitting 4% in the next year or so if we're serious about climate change. So that's out. And then, of course, there's this big scandal around the ratification of the CPTPP by Dr. Sri Azmin Ali.
That's right.
He was the
We passed
minister.
the deadline.
Yeah, he basically was the minister that blocked CPTPP on the instructions of the previous prime minister in 2018. And suddenly now, as a new minister in another government, he decides to ratify it 3 days before the parliament actually was dissolved. And when he ratified it, there was no engagement. And imagine this. From 2018 to 2022 to 2022, just before, so probably about October, December, there has been no real engagement and work done to prepare the country economically for the CPTPP. There's no non-tariff barriers that's been set up. There's no regulatory framework. Myself, as a climate change person or as an ESG person, I'm horrified by it because we've got a lot of economic activities happening now that is supporting climate change. We talked earlier about flood barriers, flood mitigation,
That's
but there's
right.
also carbon trading. There's also sequestration. There's all the penalties that's related to climate change. There's higher pressure on emissions, right? Now, we do not have the legal frameworks yet available in this country, and CPTPP comes in. Now we're going to have businesses coming into this country wanting to join this part of the economy, and in the absence of legal framework, what will happen if there's a dispute? Since we don't have the legal framework, it will have to go to the international courts. It'll have to go to the ISDS, and we will definitely be in the back foot. So I think, to me, the parliament was also disappointing because the government actually has, probably still has the opportunity, even after parliament, to make a formal declaration, we will withdraw from the CPTPP, for instance.
That's right.
Or to say there are certain policies that we will suspend and review and revamp going into the next parliament because going through the next 100 days, say, simply because this was done in a rush manner, it was done really on political incentive, and it was done really in an irresponsible manner, which hits very much on the governance side of the ESG.
And thanks so much for actually pointing out the fact that it, of course, leaves those participating interested investors in particular
Yes.
literally at sea.
Yes,
All right,
exactly.
we take a quick break, but we'll be right back after this for the last segment. Don't go anywhere. This is Wacana English Edition.
My name is Raja Fauzan from Coffee Star. I am a coffee enthusiast officer of this company. There are two uniqueness that we offer to market. Number one, selling coffee through machine alone. We don't have outlet, we don't have kiosk. And number two, the coffee that not just for you to consume, whatever you contribute to the growth of the company, we give back to society.
Every day, we collect about 5 to 10 kilograms of coffee grounds. This waste can be used as a fertilizer. So for now, this year, we distribute the coffee grounds to individual and also green finger community at our neighborhood. For example, at TTDI and also Bukit Jelutong.
Welcome back to Wacana English Edition with me, Tamina Kausji. Now, jumping straight back into the conversation of where we are now and what do we have to look forward to in 2023 in Malaysia. Prof. Terence, so looking at some of the highlights so far from the new federal government and what this means for the bigger picture of ensuring good governance and, of course, addressing the cost of living crisis. The announcements were made after the cabinet meeting on Friday about they would stop raising the electricity tariff. Bernas has been asked to donate 60 million ringgit to farmers, eggs to be imported to address shortage. What is the feeling that you are getting from these initial announcements?
Yeah, Tamina, rather than address these issues separately, the question I would then ask is, what do these issues reflect when the government made these announcements? These are issues that draw attention to major policies. For example, let's look at the policy of privatization. You talked about the power tariffs. Tenaga is a GLC. It's majority owned by the government, but it functions like a private firm, not like a public enterprise responsible for delivering affordable power supply. Let's look at Bernas. Bernas was formerly the Lembaga Padi Negara. Then it was corporatized and then transferred into private hands, into the hands of a well-connected businessman. And now they're trying to rectify that problem. So we got to have a discussion about major policies. These questions draw attention to policy reforms. What is the role of privatization? How important is privatization? What is the role of government in the economy? Those are the big governance issues that are coming out from these questions. The other issues which we can deal with, you talked about the farmers and the imported eggs. This is a food security policy issue. Now, when we talk about food security, the first thing we have to look at is let's look at the corporate sector. If you look at the number of companies that we have in this country, we have about 1.2 million companies in this country. 98% of them are SMEs. Out of these companies, only 1% of these SMEs are in the agro sector. Now, this raises an issue. If you're having a food security problem, and only 1% of the corporate sector is involved in the agro sector, how are you going to deal with these problems? So this is why I come back to my bigger question. What is the role of the government in the economy, especially when we know this economy, apart from the SMEs, a big segment of the economy is the GLCs, and the GLCs are deeply involved, including in the agro sector. Let's go on to the other issue. What does this reflect? The larger issues that they reflect is that we need to have a serious debate about our economic model, the model of economic development, which is related to some of the other issues that were also discussed earlier in this program. And we've had such a discussion before. When we have a crisis, we have this discussion. When we had the 2008 global financial crisis, the Prime Minister at that time, Najib Razak, said there's a need now for a new economic model. He introduced the government transformation plan, the economic transformation plan. But what changed? There was no major changes, although there was an acknowledgement of a need going back to 2008 for a new model of development. When the COVID affected us, we talked about the need for a digital economy. We have to move quickly into the digital economy, something we've been talking about for a long time, but had not really acted on it. What happened to that? So this brings me to, in a nutshell, I know we are running out of time, so let me be brief. What should we focus on? What should the government focus on? What should be a new, sustainable, and inclusive economic model that can be created to deal with the impending problems that we are seeing? The first, as I said earlier, what is the role of the government in the economy? We must be clear about that. Second, we have to recognize the important role of SMEs. They're such a huge component of the corporate sector. How do we bring them into the global supply chains? Rather than dealing with them separately, bring them into the global supply chains. Third, do we respect private property rights? And this speaks to the issue of needs-based versus race-based policies. That's another major issue we have to discuss. It's been on the table for a long time, but we have avoided tackling it. The next issue, are we clear about creating a real compact? This is a time for us to talk about social compacts. Governments, companies, and labor. We have to bring labor into the discussion. It's not just about PPPs, public-private partnerships. It has to be really inclusive. And the next issue, and I really have to put this on the table, education. Education to train labor appropriately for the rapidly changing economy. Our education system, the curriculum, the institutions, I'm sorry, they're really in a problem. These are real problem areas. We got to revamp the curriculum properly. We got to revamp the entire educational institutional system to make sure well-qualified teachers and academics are in the system to train this labor force. And finally, I want to end on this. None of this is going to work unless we have reforms, institutional reforms to devolve power to ensure that proper checks and balances in the system. So that's, in a nutshell, my points to you, Tamina, on good governance and the urgent need for it, and what are the issues we need to look at if you want to talk about really good sustainable governance going forward.
for really outlining very clear, actionable target areas. And speaking about labor, Adelina, I'd like to dig a little deeper on challenges facing women during this pandemic economic recovery period, the burden of unpaid care work, and the childcare crisis. Now, from WAO's perspective, what are your thoughts? Because, of course, research is showing that Malaysia has a shortage of over 80,000 childcare centers. World Bank Group showed that the opening of additional preschools can actually promote an additional 89 women entering the labor force wherever an additional preschool is open. We've got an almost 30% gap in between female and male labor force participation rate, owing overwhelmingly about 62% odd of women surveyed said it is because of unpaid care work duties, including, of course, childcare.
So, unpaid care work kind of encapsulates cooking, cleaning, household chores, caring for the elderly, caring for your children, which are very much contribute to the stability of a household and, of course, the economy as well. So, the fact that we're not recognizing that because it makes such a huge part of the economy, all these housewives at home caring for their elders and their children, is a huge loss to us because they're losing out on so much. And despite us having now like iSuri and all that, which are good steps, I think that this childcare issue is not a very complex one. It's actually a fairly simple one because childcare is just one of the main barriers why women can't enter the workforce. They can't work, they can't study, continue their studies, or another barrier why they can't re-enter after giving birth. And so if you want to encourage more women to enter the workforce, retain their jobs, and of course that can be related to closing the gender gap, we need to provide more childcare centres, and if that falls under the purview of their company or under KPWKM, that's great. But we have to really address this as soon as we can because the women and the male gender gap is already very different, very, very stark difference, right? And also with that, if we want to have more and more childcare centres, they also have to be of like reputable quality standards because we've seen many, many cases of children losing their lives and injuries and all that because they have gone to unlicensed childcare centres. So there needs to be a very, very immediate action to tackle this issue because we're losing out on so much talent and brain drain because people are staying at home and not being able to enter the workforce. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think it's crystal, but it's also about whether or not government of the day will take the opportunity to invest in this infrastructure and also build a care economy. Right. So from... Sure.
Because women are the one carrying the burden of like the household chores, it prevents them from actually, again, like I said, going to school and getting jobs, but then they're also stuck in the cycle of poverty. And if it's in an abusive household, and I have to touch on that because I'm from a domestic violence organization, they're going to be stuck in that and they're not going to be financially independent to leave that abusive cycle. And this is not just like a Malaysian issue, it's a global issue.
Absolutely. And I think the pandemic just exposed these fractures. It's not so much that it caused or created them.
For sure.
All right. So now speaking about where we go and how we move forward in 2023, one of the interesting things, Akram, that came out was government announcements so far, mini budget for education assistance. What does this augur for perhaps budget 2023 being passed or tweaked early next year?
Thanks for that. Actually, as Professor Trans Gomez said, the government shouldn't actually be looking for solutions moving forward just over the period of this 1 year. They have an opportunity now to probably use the period of redoing that budget to really do a kickstart of a total reform. Now, since we were talking about education before and also the readiness of women in the market, we have real fundamental problems in education. Like for instance, our kids are actually finishing O-levels too late. There is a social compact almost in place now that seems to be applied worldwide, that by the time you hit 17 or 18, you're expected to leave the house. Now, because of that, in most economies, most developed economies, they finish the equivalent of the O-levels 2 years before, somewhere around 15 or 16. That means that they have the period of between 16, 17, 18 to actually develop a skill.
That's right.
Or transition into higher education earlier or pre-higher education. So that means that they go to university much earlier, they finish university earlier, but even those, and more critically, for those who are actually coming from the working class, or those who are less fortunate to not be able to qualify into the university section, they can actually then go down the route of getting themselves skilled up become welders, plumbers, become IT specialists or technicians, and be ready to go to work by the age of 18, rather than just now struggling to figure out what to do and not having the right skills to be able to do it. And the result of it we're seeing now, the preponderance of, begging your pardon, but food panda, what do you call it, riders, the number of Grab riders is around there. I mean, it's good that we have an active gig economy to give people some income, but that's not sustainable. And how do they actually then develop the growth that's needed once they have families, once they actually want to own houses, own homes, etc. So I think where the government has an opportunity now, not just in terms of education, but in terms of all the other ministries that they have, what do you call it, rural development, climate, environment. They should look at this budget as not, oh, let's think about what we need to do for the next year, but let's think about how do we actually really do a kickstart for the future. I mean, you've got a couple of months. That's probably a bit too short to do massive reform.
Sure.
But you can already make certain
Strategize.
Like, I mean, education, for instance, the government actually, I think, is a bit stuck in terms of what to do. I thought Dr. Radhi Jidin absolutely failed in the opportunity that he had because of the pandemic to do education reform.
Absolutely.
People were at home for 6 months. The teachers were all figuring out what to do. And that was a period when you could have actually just called everyone up and say, look, let's take the opportunity to actually do certain things. I mean, even Dr. Mazli did better in a sense of saying, oh, this exam is redundant. Let's get rid of it. I mean, that's the sort of thinking that you need to actually have to take. That is radical. I mean, all of us are, exam oriented, right? Suddenly, no more exams. Oh my God, what are we going to do, right? But these are the political decisions that you need to make. It takes political will to make such decisions.
That's right. And it shapes the next generation.
Exactly,
right.
exactly.
Wonderful. Now, from there, Prof. Terence, I really wanted to target this one last discussion area before we just close out the entire hour with some last thoughts from each and every one of you. So the next political wave, Prof, will be the upcoming slew, potentially 6 of state elections in 2023. Among all other institutional reforms, why is it also essential to expedite the political funding bill? And why must it have a model for state funding?
Again, thank you. This is a very important question. We've been talking about political financing reform since 2009. I remember in 2007 we had the Bersih campaign, and at the Bersih campaign we also had opposition parties part of the Bersih campaign. And one of the things that they asked for in 2007 was bring an end to money politics. In 2008 we had an epochal election. 5 state governments fell. The government of the day, the Barisan Nasional, lost its 2/3 majority, and soon after that discussions started about actual reforms, one of which was bring an end to money politics. And that's when we started the discussion on political financing reforms. Interestingly enough, when Najib came to power in 2009, among the reforms he talked about was also on political financing. But he quickly binned it because he realized that it was not in his interest. It was not in the interest of UMNO to have a political financing act. And so we lost the possibility of having a political financing act. Now I'm bringing this up because in 2013 we saw a general election where the volume of money used in the election was stupendous amount of money, and we were wondering where did all this money come from. And 2 years later, in 2015, we had the 1MDB scandal, and the 1MDB scandal indicated to us 2 very important things. First, 1MDB is a GLC. And the GLC was a system through which you can get money out of the government through the GLC system and channel it into the hands of politicians who sit as directors. It can also be used to channel funds down to political members of political parties. The second thing it introduced was the foreign funding. Should we have foreign funding of a political system? Now, these were issues we discussed way back in 2009. And we had the opportunity to introduce the Political Financing Act. We didn't do it, and it led to a monumental scandal, the 1MDB. Malaysia came to be known as a kleptocracy. Did we learn the lesson of what happened? No, I'm afraid we didn't. Even when Pakatan came to power, they talked about introducing a reform of political financing, and they were in power for 2 years, and during that time, we didn't see it. And Soon after that, we had the fall of the government. And then later, just recently before the government, before we had the general election, there was talk about introducing a political financing. And because the situation was now dire, it's really serious. We need to level the political playing field. We need to ensure transparency and accountability in how parties get funds. And these were the issues we were talking about. How do we ensure that all political parties, the new parties in particular, when they enter the political arena, they have sufficient funds to compete fairly? And that was what the law is all about. How do we ensure that the existing system that we have, the financing system, which is so covert, we have no clue where the money is coming from, that this is now brought out into the light? And that is why this election, this law was very important. And one of the issues we talked about to level the playing field was public funding of parties. Now, what has been proposed is something which we see in many countries. About 70% of democracies around the world have public funding of the political system. And this is something which we have also recommended. They didn't introduce it before the election, and we saw what happened during this election. Some parties had a lot of money and other parties had no money. And this came out clearly during the campaign period. So we have to reform the system once and for all. Because the question that then arose was, where did all this money come from for the parties that did have a lot of money? We have no clue. So unless we reform this quickly, and I hope that this government will now realize once and for all, we have to have this Political Financing Act in place. And we also have to discuss important issues. The public funding of elections. Where is this money going to come from? Is it going to be part of the budget process? How much are we talking about? What about disclosure? I want to close on this point. I know we are running out of time. Disclosure is very important. We know when companies fund parties, especially those in the opposition, the government of the day can go after the funder. And this is something we want to check. We want to ensure that anyone can fund whoever they want. This proper functioning democracy. This is how it is. So these are important issues that still have not been debated in the open. These are issues we need to discuss quickly, and we need to implement it, because let me remind you, in 6 months' time, we're going to have the state elections also within the next 6 months. If it's possible, can we have this act in place as soon as possible?
Much for that, Prof. And I'd like to end with a quick 30-second from each one of you on what would you most like to see happen in 2023 with regards to the work that you do and also, of course, the well-being of the Rakyat. Adlina, if I could begin with you.
First and foremost, definitely put like all the legislation on a tighter timeline. Let's push for mums being able to pass on their citizenship. More specialized support services for children in crisis, more safeguarding training, and I think just more support for men and boys to become better allies for women, not protectors, but allies.
Thank you for that, Adlina. Excellently put. And Akram?
I suppose, thanks very much. I think two items broadly.
Sure.
Firstly, in terms of policies that were rushed and policies that were done incorrectly, or with with a shadow of doubt as to whether they were actually really for the public interest. So I mentioned earlier about withdrawing from the CPTPP, not because necessarily it's just because of the non-readiness and the rush nature of it, but also things like 5DNB, which some have said would be a potential other 1MDB, right? Because of the size, scale, and also the clear importance of us going down the 5G route that was again rushed, etc. So that's one broad area. And the second broad area is really close to heart, which is let's get our framework around climate change, get our framework around environmental protection, and updated, revamped, strengthened, and use that as a catalyst for us to actually build a green economy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Akram. And Prof. Terence, your thoughts?
I'd agree with Adlina on the important point on institutional and legislative reforms. We've talked about it at length. I'm glad to see that there is an ongoing attempt on the separation of powers between the Attorney General and the Cabinet, creating an Office of the Public Prosecutor. And as I mentioned, we need institutional reforms of the MACC. I would argue also of the public sector. We didn't discuss the issue of the procurement process. We need legislation on that to bring transparency there too. That's my first issue. The second primary concern I have on my mind is, I've mentioned this earlier, education. We really need to transform the entire education system to create creative, critical thinking, young talents. And the third issue, I want to close on this. This is, to my mind, a real problem. Can or is Malaysia's corporate sector ready to respond to the challenges ahead? I'm really worried that they are not. Are they ready to deal with the rise of the digital economy, a global digitalized economy? I'm afraid they are not. Our SMEs, I mentioned that 98.5% of them are small firms. A majority of them are micro firms. They have 5 companies and less. We have a major structural problem there. How are we going to bring them into this global supply chains? Because that's the real issue, getting them into the supply chains so that they can move up the tech ladder. I'm afraid they are just not ready. There's a lot on the plate for the government to deal with, and we have to move fast because there's a serious economic crisis coming up next year.
For also bringing back the focus to the economic behemoth that lies ahead of us in 2023. On that note, plenty more to talk about, but of course, we've come to the end of the hour. I'm Tamina Kausji signing off for Wacana English Edition, wishing all our viewers who do celebrate a very Merry Christmas and a very good end to the year. And let's look forward to a better 2023. Thank you all for joining us here for Wacana English Edition. We'll see you again next year. All right.